Hello, I'm Mike Smith, a former editor of The Age. I'm talking today to Ben Hills, the biographer of the legendary editor of The Age, Graham Perkin, of the 60s and 70s. Hello, Ben.
Hi, Mike. How are you?
Congratulations on a rattling good book. It should be on the shelves of every journalist and every journalism student. Why is it important to remember Graham Perkin?
Well, thanks for that generous introduction. Unfortunately, there's not as many journalism students or journalists as there used to be, but hopefully we'll sell a few copies. Why is he important? I think the message of Graham Perkin, the principles that he used to drive his paper, are probably just as relevant now as they were then. I wonder if I can give you a little taste of this.
Yes, please.
This is what he said way back in the 1970s about the kind of newspaper that he was trying to produce. He said, "We're trying to produce a different kind of newspaper, popular newspaper, but one with quality and breadth. It'll look at the whole world, at all people. It will attempt to spread understanding and encourage decency, discourage inhumanity, and attack prejudice. Will it sell papers will be one test, but not the only test we apply to editing tomorrow's paper. We believe there are news stories that people ought to read, even if they're the stories they may not want to read. The paper will express its own opinions as forcefully and clearly as it can. We will try to leave no doubt where the Age stands on issues and principles. Those who disagree will find us eager to publish their views. We will continue to employ writers, cartoonists and commentators who work with complete independence and integrity." Now, you won't hear many editors using those sorts of words today, but the principles that Perkin espoused are just as relevant.
It's a philosophy that could well be applied to a quality broadsheet 40 years after he wrote that.
Yes, absolutely, Mike. Yes, it could.
You've described him as the greatest Australian editor of the 20th century, and I don't hear anybody arguing with that. But who do you think would be the medal winners in that race?
Look, that's a good question. Unfortunately, you know, one of the reasons why I did this book is because there's so little written about our great editors, so little. I mean, every little tin pot footballer who ever trotted onto the field or won a Brownlow medal has got people queuing up to do his biography. Every little politician, all our international authors, in fact, are doing autobiographies, but no editors among them. I did a very thorough search. The only editor I can find is probably the only one who could lay any claim at all to challenging Graham Perkin, and that's the man who didn't quite found, but was the earliest and greatest of all the editors of The Age, David Syme.
Right. But now, he was more the 19th century, though, wasn't he?
Well, he was, and by the time the 20th century dawned, he was pretty much in his dotage. He was in his 70s and 80s. Since then, the only other person whose name you ever hear mentioned in the same breath as Graham Perkin is Adrian Deemer, a very great editor of The Australian in the 1970s. Not the founding editor, but the editor who made it popular and who drove those principles that Perkin was espousing.
You and I were very lucky to have worked in what might be described as the golden era of Australian newspapers, and we were both very lucky to work with Graham Perkin. I was just a kid. I was just a starstruck kid that held him in great awe and fear, and he was a great leader and a daunting boss. But you were much older. You were his gun reporter. What was it like to work for Graham Perkin? You quote David Austin, another fine journalist, as saying working with Perkin was like batting with Bradman. What was it like to be his gun reporter?
You've stolen my best line there, Mike, damn you. I came up from Tasmania. I think I'd caught his eye during coverage of the Tasmanian bushfires of the mid to late 60s. He was very daunting, very intimidating the first time you met him. He had these piercing blue eyes, this matted down hair, which was almost like a skull cap. His wife later told me that he used to achieve this effect because he would get out of the shower and put a football beanie on his head to flatten his hair down. In those days, curls weren't fashionable. They were seen as being a bit effeminate. And so he wanted to be as formidable as possible.
And he had a booming voice. You knew when he entered the newsroom and took his seat at the desk at night that he'd arrived.
Yes, oh yes.
And the energy and the angel dust was sparkled.
That's right. He would dominate a room. He had, it's a terribly cliched word, but he had charisma. He could walk around that newsroom, he could place his hands on your neck, look over your shoulder at what you were typing, give you some suggestions on the lead. He'd then go over to the pictorial editor, Blackie, what have you got? He had a fantastic eye for a picture. He'd then go and sit at the top table, redesigning the front page, tossing the headlines back at the subs who'd written them. He could do every job in that paper better than almost any of his people.
Absolutely. He led by example. He could make copy sparkle by rewriting it, write a brilliant headline that would make the difference between a dull page and a bright page. We'll get back to his achievements as an editor and a reporter a little later, but let's get back to his childhood. I mean, he was born in 1929 in Hopeton and brought up in nearby Beulah and Warwick-Nabil in the dusty Mallee region of Victoria. He was born into a drought. The next year there were flooding rains, and I think in the third year there was a mouse plague of proportions that only the Mallee can produce. But what was the rest of his childhood like, and what were his big influences?
You wouldn't call it impoverished. His father was a baker, and although later on he tried to rather romanticise his family history, he claimed at one stage to be descended from Scottish royalty.
Right.
But unfortunately for Graham, the investigative skills he taught me how to use have revealed that that was probably a bit of a beat-up. He came from a family, his father was a baker. He had one brother. They were born into the Depression, and almost as soon as the Depression was over, along came World War II. And so these were pretty unpromising circumstances for any young man. He grew up in a tiny country town. He wasn't terribly bright at school. His father was continually pushing him, thinking he would be the member of the family who first went to university. But unfortunately for his father's ambitions, it wasn't to be. He got him enrolled at Melbourne University in a law course, but after, he used to say that he dropped out, but in fact, if you look at his record, the first 2 years he failed every subject he took. Third year he was refused admission. Now, I've got to say this was not entirely his fault, because Latin was still compulsory as part of the law course in those days. And you can imagine Latin in Warwick-Nabil High School. I mean, they don't exactly go around reciting Catullus' poetry or reenacting Caesar's Gallic Wars, you know. So the odds were stacked against him, and it did give him a bit of an attitude towards people with tertiary education that I noticed.
Right, yeah. I mean, he did not have a stellar scholastic record, but I think it's clear from the people you talked to, he was intelligent and bright. But at school and at university, he had distractions.
Yes.
He was a prodigious reader. I think he took 20 novels out of his school library in 1 month. And he didn't mind some dalliances with the girls at school.
That's right. Look, obviously a young man's got a lot of things to distract him in the country, but Graham had a couple of things going for him. He was very bright, even though he squandered his talents and wasn't terribly successful academically. But he had an innate intelligence, there's no doubt about that. He had a very broad scope of his reading in those days, and he knew fairly on that he had what it takes to be a writer. He enlisted at the age of 12, just marched into the local newspaper office, the good old Warwick-Nabil Herald, and said, "I want to be your sports writer." And the editor, owner of the paper at that day was a man who wasn't at all foolish about money. He hired him and didn't pay him. So Graham reflected on this many years later, that country papers live on the smell of an oily rag. But from the age of 12, which is pretty remarkable, he was covering the football for them and covering the cricket for them. And doing it, I've got to say, with a bit of style even then.
Even injecting colour into those reports for a country paper at that age. But what it did give him, if it didn't give him any income, it gave him a big stack of cuttings. And when he went to Melbourne to get a job, he got his first job at The Age, which was probably at the time, in 1949, probably the dullest of Melbourne's 4 papers. It was a terrible old rag.
If you look in the back of my book, you'll see I've gone back to World War I to graph the circulation charts of the Melbourne newspapers, and it's quite interesting to look at what was happening during that period that Perkin was associated with the Age, from the 50s through to the 70s, because the circulations of Flinders Street papers, the great rivals of the Age, of course, the Herald and the Sun down at Flinders Street, were going stratospheric. The Age, the Argus, which was the sort of intelligent, the thinking person's newspaper, the one the stockbrokers read on the train on the way to work in the morning, the Argus was doing fairly well until it got bought out by a British newspaper conglomerate. The Age, though, had been staggering along, and its circulation in the 1950s was less than what it had been during World War One.
Yeah.
So it had been losing circulation, it had been losing relevance, it had no zim, no get up and go about it. It was still carrying ads on the front page well through into the 1940s when that had basically passed into history.
Probably in a death spiral.
It looks as though it was. The board it was still a family-owned business, and the board were the fortune that David Syme had accumulated in the paper had been dissipated among a couple of dozen heirs who had absolutely no interest in the paper other than the dividends that it gave them each year, which they could spend on their other pursuits like farming or whatever they were doing. They played no active part in the newspaper's management, and that was pretty much left to Syme, the two remaining Syme sons. And the two remaining Syme sons, I'm afraid, didn't have their father's ability, and the paper was really in a sad state. It was almost bankrupt, and it was quite on the card that it was going to follow the Argus down the gurgler. Yeah.
So that was the paper he arrived at. I mean, we know Perkin was a great editor, but sometimes we overlook the fact that he was a fine reporter too, wasn't he? He had a good reporting career. What were some of his better stories?
Well, he won the Walkley in the days, it was only the second or third year that the Walkley had been awarded, and he won it in the days before it had expanded into like dozens of different categories, social responsibility and journalistic leadership and all these. He won it when there was only reporting, feature writing, photography, and I think cartooning and illustration had come along. So he won a Walkley Award in the days when it was very hard to get against hundreds of opponents. He won his Walkley for witnessing open heart surgery. Now, it sounds pretty humdrum nowadays because these operations are sort of regularly videotaped and so on. But in those days, he was the first person ever to go into an operating theatre to witness this brand new operation that had been brought to Melbourne. And his piece is just absolutely brilliant, very colourful. But you've got to read it against the backdrop that society was still so old-fashioned that you weren't even allowed to mention the doctor's names. Not even the patient could be named, even though the patient wanted to be named. It was a very, very formalised, stultified sort of society that he was reporting in, which makes his achievements even greater.
Yeah, even before then, I think in your book you say his talent was first noticed when he was covering the professional wrestling.
Oh, yes.
And sending it up in lovely colour stories, treating it like vaudeville.
Yes. He started off, first and foremost, he was a sports reporter. And if anyone's watching this who has got ambitions in that direction, it was very good for him because it was the only area of sport of coverage where you were allowed to inject a little bit of your own personality, to use those naughty adjectives, and to kind of invest a bit of yourself in what you were reporting on. I mean, nowadays that's pretty humdrum. And it also
teaches you great attention to detail, because if you get a stat or a fact wrong in sport, the readers are onto you more than anything else.
That's right. But there's a description I got from someone who actually went with Graham to the old stadium in West Melbourne where the wrestling used to take place, and the audience was already seated. Perkin and his companion walked down the aisle. Everybody looked around and applauded him as he came in. I mean, he was quite a celebrity in his own right.
One of the first celebrity journalists, maybe.
Well, yeah, indeed. Although, of course, in those days, you didn't get bylines. Oh, no. It would be by innocent bystander,
Okay, he became editor in 1965, and he probably had a few things going for him. There was only upside at the Age because it was such a terrible paper. The baby boomers were becoming adults. They were better educated than any generation before them. They were becoming politically and socially aware with conscription, Vietnam War, and the rise of Gough Whitlam. He had this growing market interested in current affairs. So, but he also had a young managing director. Tell us about Ranald MacDonald.
Ranald, I describe in the book as the accidental managing director, because Ranald had been in the United States. He was sent over to complete his education, having been at Cambridge. So he had quite a leisurely upbringing. I think his greatest achievement at Cambridge had been to get a blue in golf. So, but he decided when he was in his 20s that the paper was going down the gurgler, and he felt that strange sort of Victorian thing of noblesse oblige. He felt that if he didn't pick the paper up, if he didn't give it a kick in the pants, if he didn't give it a new direction, it was going to die. And he very much had in mind his great-grandfather's ambitions and direction for the paper, its role in Melbourne and its role in society. He came along. He approached his father, David Syme's son, his grandfather, I beg your pardon, David Syme's son, and said to him, "Well, young Ranald, we've got to find a role for you around the paper. What do you want to be?" And Ranald has got this enormously bubbly, infectious way of conversing with people.
Still does.
It still does. And he started to rattle on, and phrases like marketing director, because he'd done his degree in marketing, sort of popped out, and old Mr. Syme was sort of a bit hard of hearing, getting on in years. And he thought Ranald was asking to be appointed managing director, not marketing director. So he said, "Well, I don't know about that, young Ranald. We'll have to see what the board says." So he went in and, blow me down, he managed to sell it to the board. So there was the age of the 28-year-old managing director in charge of one of Melbourne's oldest and certainly its greatest paper.
That's a lovely story and a stroke of luck for the paper, because Ranald appointed Perkin and gave him the resources and the encouragement to do the job.
Yes, he was the touchstone. There's no doubt whatsoever that if Ranald's attitude had been what today's newspaper management's is, which is as soon as your profits and circulation start falling, cut staff, cut funds, cut resources, the bottom line attitude that obsesses today's managers, I guess in response to shareholder demands on the stock market, but nevertheless, Ranald's attitude was the opposite. He squeezed more money out of the paper by cunning devices like putting an extra column of classified advertising on each page. I mean, that alone brought in tens of thousands of pounds in revenue. Yep. And the money that he generated, he reinvested into the business.
Yep.
Instead of squandering it on exalted pay for directors and chief executives.
He took a long-term strategic view, which
Absolutely.
is a foreign language in today's newspaper world.
You're quite right, Mike, he did.
Some of Perkin's biggest achievements, I guess, right up there would be instilling and generating a culture of investigative journalism at the age that still exists today. You were the head of the Insight team for many years. What were some of the big ones?
Oh, my goodness me. That's a very hard question. He's often called the founder of investigative journalism in Australia. That's a wee bit of a mistake, because David Syme himself had been an absolutely gung-ho reporter. I mean, he had got himself in all sorts of bother way back in the 19th century by, for instance, attacking the Commissioner of Railways for putting branch lines to nowhere to benefit his mates. Got involved in huge libel cases, and really that tradition, although it had fallen into disrepute before Perkin came along, had always been there.
Yep.
But Perkin reinvented it, reinvigorated it, appointed a full-time team to go and do it. We started to come up with stories, and I'm by no means the only person who was doing this. There were people like John Tidy and John Larkin, who were the first Insight reporters there. And when I left the Age to go overseas, the torch was handed on to people like David Wilson, who were great reporters in their own right. The stories that happened on my watch, I guess, that are most remembered are stories that led to the downfall of governments on both sides of politics. In Victoria, we began a series of investigations into corruption in the Victorian Housing Commission.
Yep.
They'd been basically paying kickbacks to people whose land was being acquired for public housing. And that story probably contributed, was a factor in the defeat of the Hamer government in the 1970s. This is after Perkin's death, the story kept going. The other story, the bird is on the other foot, probably the Whitlam government's downfall. The chain of events that led to that was triggered by the Age.
Yeah, we'll come back to that, but others included the campaign that Perkin ran for justice for the thalidomide children. I mean, like many in the of the Insight style of stories, it was modelled on the Insight team of the Sunday Times that was run by Perkin's old friend Harold Evans. There was a campaign for the minus children, intellectually handicapped children in Melbourne that brought great change. A whole stream of stories, and the tradition does continue today.
Absolutely right. In fact, he pinched the name. The Age's Insight. He pinched the name from Harold Evans.
He wasn't
over there to work with his team to actually pick up a few clues. So he was totally unafraid of borrowing other people's good ideas.
Absolutely. I mean, he confessed to that several times.
Yes,
that's one of the traits you need. Don't be afraid to borrow other ideas or be derivative.
That's right.
Another great thing he did, I mean, I think when he became editor of The Age, there was no cartoonist at The Age, but he set in train a series of hirings that ultimately led, after Perkin died, to, I think, probably the greatest stable of cartoonists ever assembled in a single newspaper in the world. At one stage, The Age had Petty, Arthur Horner, Les Tanner, John Spooner, Michael Leunig, Ron Tanberg, and Peter Nicholson. I don't think there will be a team like that assembled in one paper ever again.
No, a tremendous collection of talent, and he had a very good eye, an eye for design, an eye for a picture. There's a wonderful story that I, in fact, don't include in the book that'll probably give you an idea of this. During the dying years of the Vietnam War, he was given a picture by Ray Blackburn, the pictorial editor there, which had come in on the wire service. It was the most appalling tragedy. A C-130 Galaxy had crashed taking off from Thomson Nut Airport in Saigon. And an American, I mean, it almost makes you want to choke up now just to tell the story, an American soldier, the plane was full of children, of orphans who were being evacuated from the war. And an American soldier is walking out of the wreckage carrying the body of a little child by the arm. And Blackie said to Graham, "You can't use that. You just can't use that." Perkin put it on his desk. He got the comments from everyone who walked by behind him. And eventually he decided he was going to use it. No matter how upsetting it was going to be, and believe me, lots and lots of people rang up and cancelled their subscriptions because it was just too horrible and too shocking. But Perkin believed in getting the reality of that war over, and that was the way to do it.
Yep. He also took the paper into areas of journalism that hadn't been done before. He opened new areas like the environment, science, women's affairs, even food reviewing.
Absolutely.
And I think you were one of the first reviewers of food.
Yes,
columns.
Indeed. The late, great Peter Smark, myself, and Claude Farrell, who actually is still around doing food reviews. We started off, it was quite a flowering, I mean, all the arts, not just the culinary arts, but the visual arts. The new National Gallery of Victoria building was being constructed at the time. So along came Patrick McCackey to be our arts editor. I mean, he later had a stellar career as an art gallery director himself. The arts were flourishing. Architecture was flourishing. You know, the Great Australian Ugliness book had just been written, and we were re-examining our attitudes towards suburban architecture. The culinary arts, of course, but you had to step a little bit carefully in those days. Restaurants, the first of the great Melbourne chefs were coming along, people like Mietta O'Donnell, Tansy Good, Stephanie Alexander were all the great new coming names. But Perkin always insisted on personally vetting the food reviews. He was quite a fang man himself, so he wanted to know where the good restaurants were. But woe betide you if you came up with an opinion that didn't coincide with his. I remember once one of the food reviewers described the first Japanese restaurant, which was the Stonehouse in Melbourne. eating raw squid for the first time and describing it as like chewing on old condoms. Perkin looked at this in horror, struck it out, and he said, "Well, I quite like squid sashimi, chap."
There were some big stories in Perkin's time. The moon landing, there was Cyclone Tracy, Westgate Bridge disaster, but no story was bigger than the Loans Affair and the downfall of the Whitlam government. There's a bit of mythology about who did most to bring down that government.
Yeah.
Was it Perkin and the Age, or was it his old sparring partner John Fitzgerald at the Herald? I think there's a bit each way, isn't there? Tell us the story.
Well, the short form is the Age started it, the Herald finished it. It began with a strange little housing development down on the western shores of Port Phillip Bay. And Perkin came to me with a tip-off about this, because the son of the then Treasurer, Jim Cairns, Philip Cairns, a sort of portly, bearded kind of a chap, was working in his father's office and had basically got himself involved in promoting this housing subdivision. He was writing away to all sorts of shonky financiers to try and raise money, but using the imprimatur of his father's office. So there were letters going out on the letterhead of the Treasurer of Australia, thanks very much, seeking billions of dollars for this housing subdivision down on Port Phillip Bay. Now that basically was the lighting of the blue touch paper that led to the explosion of the Whitlam government, because what that led to was a series of loan negotiations that had taken place in London with the knowledge of the Minister for Minerals and Energy, Rex Connor. Peter Cole Adams, who was then the London correspondent, went to an address that I'd discovered, and he managed to get hold of the cheques from a middleman, which proved that commissions were being paid. Now, this was completely illegal.
Yep, and a big story.
He was attempting to raise billions of dollars for Australian infrastructure schemes like gas pipelines and all sorts of schemes.
And bypassing the Loan Council.
Bypassing the Loans Council without the approval of Cabinet and without mentioning a word of it to the Australian electorate when he'd gone to the polls. So that was the trigger, the so-called reprehensible circumstance that Fraser used to block supply in the Senate and force an early election.
Yep.
So the fuse was lit in the Melbourne Age. The final stepping stone, if you like, to disaster for the Whitlam government was when one of the middlemen, a guy called Tirath Hassaram Kemlani, he's also known as Old Rice and Monkey Nuts because he used to live on cigarettes and peanuts, which he carried around his neck in a little leather pouch along with all his documents. Fitzgerald at the Melbourne Herald and one of his gun reporters tracked down Kemlani and got from Kemlani the final documentation. That was the proof, because you see the Labor government just kept on denying that there were any such negotiations going on. But here was the living proof. So it began at the Age, it finished up at Flinders Street, and that was the end of Whitlam.
Yeah, one of the things I most admire Perkin for was that he sent a telegram to the editor of the Herald, John Fitzgerald, and said, "You beat the pants off us.
Congratulations."
Congratulations to you and Peter Game."
Correct.
They don't do that anymore these days, do they?
No, they don't. No, he had a generosity of spirit even when he was beaten. Although he did ring up one of his correspondents in Canberra and said, "Get your ass down here, I want something to kick."
Ben, you have to tell us the story about Perkin's confrontation with the board over the editorial line for the 1974 election. Did he put his job on the line?
Oh, absolutely. No doubt about that at all. In the 1972 election, the Age had become almost the only serious metropolitan newspaper to support the election of a Labor government since World War II. I mean, don't forget we'd had 26 solid years of Menzies and the Liberals, and every single paper on every occasion, every important paper on every occasion had said return the Menzies government. So this was absolutely radical. Now, you can argue if you like about how much effect this had on the electorate, whether people actually read editorials, if they read them, whether it affects their voting behaviour. You can argue about that till the cows come home, but it undoubtedly legitimised the possibility of a Labor government to have a major national newspaper come out in favour of it. So that was the first thing. They had got that past the board. They had a very conservative board at the time headed by Lieutenant Colonel E.H.B. Neil, retired.
This was the Syme board, not the Fairfax board.
The Syme board.
Yeah.
The Syme board basically had been sidestepped by Ranald MacDonald and Graham Perkin over the 1972 election. They had already set up support for the Labor government by a series of editorials which supported various Labor government proposals, like, for instance, Medibank, which was the first national health insurance scheme. And so the stage was already set. By the time...
There was an inevitability.
That's right. But there was a momentum there, and by the time the Age Board sort of focused on the fact that editorials were pointing in the direction of advocating a Labor government, it was too late. And the Fairfax representative on the Syme board was obliged to say, look, we can't back down now, we'll look just ridiculous, but we won't let it happen again. Flash forward to 1974, both the Fairfax board and the Syme board are now very well aware of the sympathies of Perkin and Ranald MacDonald. They've seen editorials going in the paper which condemn the Liberal Party for not allowing the Labor government to serve its natural 3-year course. They knew which direction Ranald and Graham were thinking, and they were on it, absolutely on it. Perkin had written an editorial, a final editorial to be published on the Saturday of the election in 1974. He flew up to Sydney with it. He was asked to go and address the board, and Rupert Henderson went through it with a blue pencil. Perkin had in his pocket his own resignation and the resignations of some of his senior staff. People like Cameron Forbes and so on had said, Graham, if you're going, we're going. And it would have been quite a dramatic thing. But funnily enough, it had the opposite effect. Mm-hmm. Because when Perkin got there and the board was going through and blue penciling his editorial, what he was thinking about was, hey, if I go, all these guys with their young families are going to lose their jobs. Where are they going to get work? I can't do it. So he gritted his teeth. He fought as hard as he could for a compromise kind of editorial. And if you go back and read it, it is almost incomprehensible.
One of those on the other hand.
It is, although it does advocate, you've got to admit, it does advocate the election, not of a Labor government, which Perkin wanted, but a Liberal government. And he was very angry about that. He was very embarrassed about that. But he didn't put in his resignation because he thought that so many of his people would have to be forced to resign with him, and he didn't want the responsibility of putting them all out of work. And so that's what happened in 1974.
Yeah, and 18 months later, his final editorial he was responsible for was possibly one of the finest editorials published in the paper. I think it was headed Go Now, Go Decently.
Correct.
Telling Gough Whitlam where to go.
Yes, and it was written 48 hours before his death. It draws actually, if you read it, the cadences of it on Cromwell's speech to the Rump Parliament, and it is absolutely unequivocal that the Labor government has lost its way, lost its credibility, and must resign. And believe me, if Perkin had lived until December of 1975, when the third election was held, there is no doubt in my mind whatsoever that he would have advocated the dismissal of the Labor government. You know, there's a myth that's got around about Perkin's politics, and I'd like, if I may, Mike, to have a little bit of time to expand on this. There are a lot of right-wing critics, like Henderson and so on, who refer to the Age as, you know, the Guardian on the Yarra and the Spencer Street Soviet and these kinds of disparaging terms. Certainly during Perkin's era, nothing could be further from the truth. He was a country boy, he was conservative. His father was conservative. In fact, I think his father probably believed in capital punishment, if the truth be told, which was something that Perkin very strongly opposed himself.
And if anything, more small L liberal than leftish.
I think so. I think he was a liberal in the Victorian tradition. And certainly not a Labor Party supporter. If you look at his editorials, 3 state elections, 1 he sat on the fence, 2 he advocated a vote for the Liberals, including a vote for Henry Bolte, whom he just locked horns with in a fight to the death over capital punishment, over the Ryan hanging. And then the two federal government elections, the first of which the Vietnam election three federal government elections, the first of which in 1969, the so-called Vietnam election. He advocated a vote for the Liberals. The second was the 72 election. He advocated a vote for Labor. That was the only one out of the 5 or 6 elections in which the Age advocated a vote for the Labor Party. So, I mean, you really cannot look at the evidence and come to the conclusion that Perkin was a Labor man. No way in the world.
Yep. Finally, Ben, what do you think Perkin would do with today's broadsheets, with the challenges they've got now with the internet?
Like, he would be reaching out towards the internet with both hands. Do you know where he'd be today? He'd be on a plane. He would be on his way to New York to sign up Julian Assange and WikiLeaks as the Age's new prime investigative unit. That's where he'd be. Yeah.
Look, he embraced new technology. He embraced television before most journalists.
Yeah.
He used television to advocate not just for the paper, but for himself and for press freedom. I'm sure he would have been an early adapter of the internet. He wouldn't have pretended for 10 years that it didn't exist.
No.
He would have used it to connect with readers. It's a perfect way to connect with readers.
I'm sure his strategy would have been quite different from the strategy of today's newspaper management. And don't forget that if he had lived, the very day that he died, he was on his way to Sydney, where he was going to be appointed Chief Executive of Fairfax. And it's very interesting to speculate on the different direction that Fairfax might have taken if he had taken over. And I'm quite sure it would have been a different company today. I'm sure that he would have seen the threat of the internet coming and would have moved quickly to colonise that space and to transfer the value of those great mastheads, the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age and the Australian Financial Review, to the internet, instead of which the Fairfax board just sat there like rabbits in the spotlight while the internet ran over them.
And I'm sure he wouldn't have let inside the door people like Warwick Fairfax or Conrad Black.
I think he would have done his best to stop them, although, the voting power that young Warwick commanded after he persuaded his siblings to sign their shares over to him might have been pretty formidable. And I tell you what, you wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of Mary Fairfax either.
Ben, I think we'll finish with a clip from an ABC television interview Perkin did, 40 years ago, talking about the definition of a muckraking newspaper.
It was one of the last interviews he did. It was with the ABC's Checkerboard program. And if you watch this and listen to what he's saying, these principles ought to be inscribed on every newsroom wall in this country and on the walls of every faculty of journalism in this country. So we'll let Graham have the last word.
Thank you, Ben Hills.
Thank you, Mike.
Are you prepared to run stories which may offend readers, which may lose your readers, because you believe it's in the public interest, because you believe you're performing a public service in doing that? The role we've consciously tried to adopt is the role which I believe fulfills the Age's tradition, and that is as a campaigning newspaper. I believe that that muckraking is a legitimate newspaper function. That if there's muck to be raked, then it's a newspaper's responsibility to get in and rake it, because I believe there are a few other institutions in the community which can do it. Our attitude has been, in the 8 years that I've been editing the paper, to campaign where we find issues in which we believe there is public interest involved. Absolute objectivity seems to me to be probably unattainable. I think everybody, whether you work on a newspaper or not, has built-in beliefs and prejudices, which have obviously got to control. If you're talking about newspapers, convictions and prejudices and beliefs affect the judgment he makes on stories, on the treatment of stories, on the words in stories. I hope that the people that we try to bring into journalism these days are people with convictions and with beliefs. I don't particularly care for people who believe in nothing, who are complete cynics about the world. These people seem to me to be positively dangerous. But what I would, rather than use the word objectivity, the word I would use is balance and fairness.